Right. All right. We had some technical glitches last Thursday. So today, let's try to finish talking about evolution. I'd introduced a pretty drawn out case study of some desert fish, the Mojave Desert pupfish that I've always enjoyed looking at every time I get to go out there. It's a bit of a drive, but you could easily go out and see them yourselves if you wanted to. They're mostly in protected areas that do allow visitors. You could start by going to Vegas and then driving out to Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, about an hour outside the town of Pahrump, which rhymes with dump. Anyway, there's tons of variations that we could tell on this story. You could tell something very similar about finches in the Galapagos, or cichlid fish in East Africa, or salamanders in the Sierra Nevada mountains, or honey creeper birds and silver sword plants in Hawaii. This happens all over the world in all kinds of places. And I'm not going to specifically ask you questions about pupfish. What I am going to ask about, and what it is important for you to know, is how we put the pieces together and infer something that we usually cannot directly see because it happened in the past. That's the formation of species. And I wanted to give you some sense of how we can begin to reconstruct what we call the tree of life, the relationships of all of the world's species of living thing through common ancestry. And we represent those patterns of common ancestry with branching diagrams like this one. The data that this is based on is data from DNA that I will talk about later. Don't worry about it right this minute. But suffice it to say that each one of the names that you're seeing is the name of a is the name of a species of pupfish. And any two pupfish that branch from the same point, we hypothesize descended from a common ancestor. For some reason, I can't pull the pen up, so I can't doodle on this slide. But you might notice some small numbers. Don't worry about what the numbers are. That's got to do with the statistics that we use to dry this up. But you'll notice that at almost every number, there's a pair of branches going up and down and then bending to the right. Every point where a number is represents a species that we may not have direct evidence of, but we think it was a common ancestor. So Cyprinodon radiosus, the Owens Valley pupfish, shared a common ancestor if you went back in time with Cyprinodon macularius. And all of the Amargosa pupfish shared a common ancestor with the Salt Creek and the Devil's Hole pupfish. And then all of those share a common ancestor with a species called Cyprinodon fontinalis, and so on. That's what a cladogram is. It's a hypothesis of relationship through common ancestry. I think the last point I was trying to make is that the reasoning is a bit like if you were to look at a phone directory of Conway, you might notice that we've got large numbers of people named Moix, Hambeacon, Siebenmorgen, Ott, and Frealdenhoven, and Maltbia. And the simplest explanation for how they got there is that all of the Moixes are in town are descended from some guy named Mr. Moix, who came to Conway, I'm guessing in the 1870s, which is when this town was founded, and married and had kids, and they inherited his name, and then those kids had kids who inherited the name. And so the reason why we have a bunch of Moixes in the phone book is because we have a bunch of people that inherited that name from a common ancestor. And I'd be right, even if I don't happen to know who that common ancestor was. I don't know who the first Frealdenhoven in Conway was, although I assume it's recorded somewhere. But I can make a very reasonable inference that all of the Frealdenhovens in Conway today are descended from this common ancestor. And we can use similar lines of reasoning to push the cladograms farther back. Cyprinodontidae is the family in which we put all of the pupfish, and we think they shared a common ancestor with fish in families called the Fundulidae and the Posilidae. Fundulidae, or you all right? Sorry, Fundulidae are known as killifish, and Posilidae includes guppies and swordfish and platies, all of which are pretty common in pet stores. You could go out and see a bunch of them today at Petco or PetSmart or Pet Country if you felt like it. And if we take this even farther back, there's how those fish share common ancestry with other groups. You certainly don't have to read all of this. I don't even know what half of these are. I'm not a fishiologist. Although we do have fish specialists on the faculty. You can talk to Dr. Adams or his wife, Dr. Adams, if you're curious about fish. And then all of these fish are in there, and they share a common ancestor with all other fish, all 25,000 species of them. And what you're looking at is the cladogram that represents our current best hypothesis of common ancestry for all these fish. There is a link to the technical details if you ever want to see them. And we could keep going back and back and back, and we now have a pretty good hypothesis that's constantly being tested and still being fiddled with, but the basic outlines seem to be pretty clear, that we can reconstruct the common ancestry of all living and extinct organisms, which currently looks like this. Like the eukaryotes are that branch way down at the lower right. Our closest relatives actually seem to be the archaea. There's a ridiculous number of different groups of bacteria. The ultimate root of the whole thing is affectionately known as LUCA, standing for Last Universal Common Ancestor. We do have fossil bacteria, believe it or not, going back a very long way. We don't know exactly what LUCA was, although we've got some pretty good ideas as to what LUCA must have been like. And we continue to refine our picture of the tree and our picture of what might be at the root. LUCA would have lived approximately on the order of 4 billion years ago, maybe a bit less. We've got fossils going back 3.8 billion years ago. Billion's a lot. Let me put this in a metaphor you can visualize more easily. Imagine that you could represent the entire length of time that there's been an Earth as a 1,000 sheet roll of toilet paper. Okay, with me so far. You represent all of Earth history as one great big, 1,000 sheet roll of toilet paper. The length of time that humanity has been around is about the length of the little fringy, tattered fibers on the last sheet. The length of time that humans have been present is maybe a millimeter compared to the length of that 1,000 sheet roll of toilet paper. That's how long a time scale is that we're talking about. And that's the time scale that takes us from LUCA to everything that we see alive now. I'm not going to say more about LUCA, not because I couldn't. If you ever get to take Biology 4490, we talk a little bit more about that. talking about it in detail requires a lot of chemistry that you are perfectly capable of learning, but it takes more time than we've got. So I'm going to kind of draw the curtain down deliberately right about there. But how do we get off drawing cladograms in the first place? Cladograms are hypotheses, and we test hypotheses, and we reconstruct cladograms based on shared characters. You know, you and your sister or your brother, if you have one, have a lot more features in common than you and some random person picked up off the street, right? You and your sister would expect to share, I don't know, similar shape of the nose, similar eye color, similar facial shape, similar, I don't know, similar voices, you know, maybe to some extent, similar personalities. You know, you and your siblings share features in common. And the same basic logic works for drawing up cladograms. Two living things that share a common ancestor are more likely to share features in common than two living things that are more distant. So for example, over at the top right, rodents is represented by a mouse and primates by a gorilla. You might not think that rodents and primates have a lot in common, but they both have hair. They both nourish their babies with milk. They both give birth to live babies that are carried in a uterus and fed through a placenta. They both have even some fairly obscure things like a diaphragm, for example. That's something that all mammals share. They both share red blood cells that, if they're mature, lose their nuclei. That's something that's unique to mammals. So all of those together support the hypothesis that rodents and primates, and actually a lot of other critters, not just them, have those features because they inherited them from some common ancestor, some very early mammal. We've actually got fossils of some very early mammals that are good candidates. If you saw one, you might think it was a shrew, although it technically would not have been. And then if you go farther back, rodents, primates, mammals in general, reptiles and birds may not look like each other, but we think they all descended from a common ancestor because they all have embryos that are protected by amniotic membranes. In mammals, in you, this is what they call the bag of waters, the fluid-filled sac that surrounded you and cushioned you and protected you when you were in your mama's uterus. Some of those amniotic membranes got modified to form the placenta, the organ that fed you when you were inside your mama's uterus. Those same basic membranes are present in bird and reptile eggs. You would not normally see this in the chicken eggs that you might buy in a supermarket because those are supposed to be unfertilized. But if you were to break open a fertilized chicken egg that had been incubated for a few days, you would definitely see them. And those amniotic membranes are something shared by all reptiles, birds, and mammals. Going farther back, reptiles, birds, mammals, and amphibians all share having 4 limbs. Go farther back, and all of those plus fish all share vertebrae, a backbone, a chain of bones underneath the spinal cord that supports the body and protects the spine, and so on. So we test our various cladograms and we pick the ones that are best based on which ones have the greatest number of shared characters. It's possible that the gorilla evolved directly from a fish, but we really don't have any good evidence for that. Whereas there really aren't a lot of shared features that are specific to fish and gorillas, whereas there's a lot that gorillas and mice have in common, more than it might seem. And that's the basic logic behind this. We look for characters that are shared to reconstruct evolutionary history. These days, we use characters that are derived from DNA as well, and I'll talk about that in time. And I emphasize this because people often have the idea that evolution is all about the single march of progress, from the goo to the zoo to you, as they say. So over at the far left, you've got some little blob in the water, and just ahead of it, there's a fish, and just ahead of that, there's some fishoid on land, which is turning into some reptile, which is turned into some mammal, which is turned into some ape, which is turned into a caveman, which is turned into us at the far right. People think that evolution tends to work like the Apple iPhone, that each form appears and then it gets replaced by the next one. So you gave up your iPhone 4 for the iPhone 5, and then the iPhone 5 is replaced by the iPhone 6, and the iPhone 6 is replaced by the iPhone 7, and we're currently up to the iPhone 13, I think. That basically each living thing appears and then is replaced by the next upgrade, with us at the head of the line. That's actually a very wrong idea for how evolution works. Evolution makes trees. The things that you're seeing on the screen here, those are diagrams of fossil fish, and it's not really important what the details look like, but those are fossil fish of various sorts, and we've tried to draw up a cladogram for them, working out the branching pattern of species through time. And what we fundamentally do is try to reconstruct that pattern of branching through time. I have engaged in public debates with people who have clearly been listening to entirely too much Jars of Clay and Reliant K. That may tell you how long ago it was. Who tell me that evolution has to be false because there's no way we'd ever see a cat turning into a dog. We can take cats and turn them into other varieties of cat, like with curly ears and things like that. And we can take wolves and turn them into everything from bloodhounds to pugs to chihuahuas. And that's perfectly true. But nobody's making that claim in the first place. Cats did not evolve from dogs, nor did dogs evolve from cats. They're related through common ancestry. Their relationship is a cousin relationship. They're both descended from a small extinct mammal, probably of a type called a miacid, which would have looked like that, except we don't know what the color is, but we do have the skeleton. It would have looked a little bit like a tree climbing weasel. Something like that miacid would be the common ancestor of not just dogs and cats, but raccoons and bears and ferrets and weasels and coati mundis and lions and tigers and quite a lot of other mammals would be descended from that miacid. I look at it like this. When I was at my dad's mother's funeral, it was a few years ago, and she lived a very long life and died peacefully in her sleep. It was sad we won't get to see her, but there was no real tragedy about it. And once the service was done, we all trooped into the basement of First United Methodist Church in Iowa Falls, Iowa, because you're not properly buried if they don't have a big potluck supper after the service. So there was lots of tuna casserole and potato salad because this is Iowa we're talking about. And I was related in some way to most of the people in that church basement. Only one person there was my direct ancestor. That was my father. Most of the people that were there were not my direct ancestors. They were aunts and uncles and cousins once removed, and second cousins, and great aunts and great uncles. And we're not quite sure how we're related to you, but you're welcome to come as long as you bring that really good coleslaw that you make. And if you've had family reunions, I'm assuming it's a similar situation for you, unless you happen to be an only child and your parents were both only children, then you probably have a lot more cousins and aunts and uncles than you have direct ancestors. And the same is true for all of life. Living things relate to each other through these common ancestry relationships, which we represent on cladograms. That's how that works. And the same applies to human evolution. We've got lots of fossils, and we keep finding more that indicate that our own species has changed over time. These are 4 different human relatives. We've got Australopithecus africanus, Homo rudolfensis, Homo heidelbergensis, and Australopithecus robustus. They're related to us more closely than any living species is. They look somewhat human-like, but not entirely. The faces tend to project more, and the brain cases are not as large. And they indicate that our closest living relatives are the African great apes, that we branched off from chimps roughly 5.5 million years ago. And we've got some fossils that are very close to that time frame. And every so often we find more. This was a discovery about 6 years ago of the remains of 15 individuals of a new species of human relative called Homo naledi. This was found in a cave in southern Africa, I want to say in Swaziland. This was a discovery that was finally announced in 2018, a nearly complete skeleton of a human relative belonging to the species Australopithecus africanus, but unofficially named Littlefoot. Not the dinosaur Littlefoot. This was a different Littlefoot. So we keep finding new things. You know, the field is very much open to new discoveries. What we don't do is line up fossils in a single march of progress like this. Diagrams like this you see everywhere. This is actually from a Time Life book from the 1960s. And over at the far left, you have, Bonzo the chimp is walking at the very back. And then standing up ahead, but still walking stooped over, you've got Oog, the ape man, and then, Glorg, the other ape man, and then Booga, the caveman, and Korg, the Neanderthal. And leading the march of progress, we have Fred, the naked white guy. And it always does seem to be Fred, the naked white guy in the lead. Why they don't do this with, women or non-white guys, I don't really know. But the point is, by the way, one student asked this years ago, and the answer is we don't have direct fossil evidence, but we're pretty sure that all of these did have genitals. The diagrams are always drawn with the hips turned in such a way that you can't see anybody's junk, but we're pretty sure that Neanderthals and Homo habilis and Shivapithecus and all that had dongs, except for the ones that had hoo-has. Right. In case anybody was wondering, somebody actually said that, asked that question because in all these diagrams, they never depict that. But yeah, they probably did. Okay. More importantly, this gives the impression that human evolution has been a lot like Apple's iPhones, with every lower form getting replaced by a higher form that's ahead of it in this steady chain of progress, all the way up to naked white men who are the absolute top of the line the iPhone 15 with 5G of the living world. That's not the way to look at it. There is no most advanced or most evolved form. You know, we all have evolutionary histories going back exactly the same length of time, if you think about it. There, hit admit. And that's a much more accurate diagram of how human evolution works. And again, you do not need to see all of these details. What you're looking at is a graph where you have time over on the left, with the oldest at the bottom, youngest up at the top. Each of these blue bars represents a length of time that a particular species of human relative or hominid was present on Earth. And the dashed lines include our current best tested hypothesis for how these were related to each other. The details are always getting revised on this. Don't take this as any kind of, you know, authoritative gospel or anything like that. What I want to show is that the way we think about human evolution is a branching diagram. Evolution makes trees. And just like most of the people in that church basement in Iowa Falls were related to me, but not my direct ancestors, most of the fossils that we dig up of human relatives are related to you, but not your direct ancestors. And that's exactly what we would expect. That's fundamentally the way that evolution works. So there, don't think of it as these marches of progress. Think of it as a branching pattern that makes trees. That's the way it works. And we reconstruct what those trees look like, looking for patterns of shared features. Final bit of a rant as to what evolution is not. Evolution is not necessarily progress. I was already trying to make that point by talking about iPhones. On the right, you've got bacteria of a type we didn't talk about. They're called blue-green bacteria. They're photosynthetic, so they take up light energy and use that to run their metabolism. They'd be really common if you've ever seen like a fish pond or a cattle watering pond in the summer, especially if there's lots of cow dung washing into it. The water may turn this kind of bluish green color. That would be the growth of blue-green bacteria. They can grow in such numbers that they can stain the water bluish green. And on the right are some living blue-green bacteria. On the left are some rock samples from the Australian desert that have been sliced so thin that they're translucent and examined under a microscope. We can actually do this with diamond saws. And these particular rocks actually have fossil bacteria inside, and you can hardly tell them apart from the living ones. Blue-green bacteria haven't changed in any way that we can measure between 2 billion years ago and now. That might sound like, that might sound like some kind of refutation of evolution, but evolution is not a conveyor belt that carries everything on the march of progress. It doesn't work that way. Blue-green bacteria 2 billion years ago evidently found a way of life that worked well enough for them, and they've kept it. Because they probably have not been subjected to natural selection that would cause them to change it. Much like some human groups like the Amish still live in a very simple lifestyle using technology that most of us have long given up. Some groups just stick with, find a good thing and stick with it and don't change. And that's just the way it goes. I hate the expression survival of the fittest for talking about evolution. A better one would be survival of whatever works. And evidently being a blue-green alga works perfectly well and has for the past 2 billion years or so. Actually, probably longer than that, probably closer to 3.5 billion. So evolution does not necessarily involve progress. It doesn't always involve change. The other reason why I hate the phrase survival of the fittest, well, there's two. First of all, Darwin didn't say it. That was coined by this philosopher named Herbert Spencer, one of the most boring humans in history. And the second is fitness does have a technical meaning when you get into the mathematics that we can use to model evolution, but it doesn't mean what you think it does. If I say survival of the fittest, you're likely to think of survival of the meanest, survival of the most ruthless predator, ferociously bringing, a ferocious lion savagely bringing down an antelope on the Serengeti plain, or a ruthless and brutal white shark savagely tearing apart a helpless surfer in the middle of the ocean, or whatever it is they're showing on Animal Planet this week. We tend to like savage predators being savage and bloody and, ruthless. That's cool. That's not what we mean by fitness. Evolution does not mean survival of the meanest. Very, 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 very often, the living things that have the best odds of not just surviving, but reproducing and making more critters like themselves are the most cooperative. And towards the end of this course, you will see an absolutely spectacular example of this. But evolution is not survival of the most ruthless. Sometimes it is survival of the nicest. Sometimes it is survival of the most cooperative. Evolution is survival and reproduction of whatever works. And evolution is not some kind of justification to go out and be mean to people because, hey, it's survival of the fittest. No, that's not how evolution works. Okay, finally, this being Arkansas, I have lived here for, oh my God, it's almost 24 years. Sorry, suddenly it doesn't seem that long, and I just got hit with a wave of nostalgia. And before that, I grew up in Louisiana. I'm well aware that there are people in this country and even in this state and possibly in this course who have objections to evolutionary biology based on their religious beliefs. I don't particularly want to destroy anybody's faith. That's not what I'm being paid to do. If your faith makes you a better person than you otherwise would be, more compassionate, more generous, less of an asshole than you would be if you didn't have it, then keep it. That's great. There is beauty in having religious faith, and I'm not out to make you abandon it. That it's really none of my business is what it is. I will say that there's a long tradition of what's called theistic evolution, which interprets biological evolution as being not against religion, but the way in which God, however you conceive of God, the way in which God accomplishes the ultimate purpose of existence. That basically evolution happens the way the scientists said, but it's all fundamentally part of the divine plan, which is grander than anything we can conceive. Not my place to say whether that's right or wrong. That's not my job. Science doesn't really deal with the spiritual very well. You can explore this in any way that you want to. I will say that many Christian denominations and traditions, as well as many traditions within Judaism, Islam, other world religions, have no real difficulty accepting biological evolution. That's only some movements within Christianity that raise objections to it. The Roman Catholic Church doesn't have a problem with it. The most mainline Protestant denominations don't. There are ways in which the two can be accommodated. And again, it's not my place to tell you what those are, but some people might appreciate hearing that this is something that you can explore. This is an idea that's out there. I'll leave the last word on that to Chuck D, who says that a man, or we'd now say a woman too, who wishes to form a judgment on this subject must weigh the evidence for himself. He ought not to be influenced by being told that a considerable number of scientific men can reconcile the results of science with revealed or natural religion, whilst others cannot do so. In other words, you figure it out for yourself. You know, we've all got our own ideas on that. I do not require students to believe, hell, a word I say. You know, you can treat all of this as, you know, some, you know, airy-fairy satanic idea who's, you know, invented by Satan to make you vote Democratic and accept socialized medicine or something like that. Whatever, not my business. What you are required to do is understand how it works and understand how scientists put facts and reasoning together to come up with the grand theory of evolution. You're required to understand how we do this. Whether you buy it or not is none of my concern. Okay, great. We've still got plenty of time. This is the last thing I'm going to test you on. The testable material ends here, but I'm going to keep going with the lecture because we're a little bit behind where I thought we were going to be. And so let us march onward. Come on, march onward, dang it. Darwin's book, laying out his ideas, which was called On the Origin of Species, was published in 1859. Don't memorize the date. The book is readily available for free online. I've always cherished the Amazon review by somebody who opened it, expected Darwin was going to come out with this double-barreled assault on God, Jesus, Santa Claus, Christmas, America, and apple pie, and was very confused to find out that the first chapter is all about pigeons. It was like, you know, they were expecting something that they didn't actually get. It's reading it is kind of the equivalent of watching a chess game. If you know the rules, it's tremendously exciting. If you don't, it's a couple of geeks staring at a board. But it came out in 1859, and by about 1870, just about all scientists who had studied the matter agreed that some form of evolution, some form of historical natural process operating over time was responsible for all of that diversity of life on Earth. Everything from bacteria to Representative French Hill. Sorry, first guy I could think of. Everything from the goo to the zoo to you existed because of some kind of process that was natural and operated over extremely long periods of time. However, Darwin left a couple of gaping holes in his original theory, and it was not widely accepted during Darwin's own lifetime. And the gaping holes that we'll look at is that for natural selection to work, living things have to vary, right? The members of the population have to be different from each other. And they also have to be able to pass their traits on to the next generation. So natural selection depends on variation and it depends on heredity. Now, both of those are facts. You know, you could look at, you know, a litter of kittens or, you know, the population of this class, or, you know, the tomato plants in your garden, anything like that, and you would observe variation. Humans are all different from each other, so are cats and tomato plants and everything else. And we know that heredity works because you can see it in your own families, that you have features that you inherited from your parents. If you have kids, they will look like you because you will pass on those features to the next generation. You could see this in, any farmer can see it in the animals that he or she breeds. We know that variation and heredity are real. The problem is that Darwin had no understanding of how those worked. Why do living things vary? How do they pass their traits on to the next generation? To be fair, neither did anyone else. This was a big black box back in the late 19th century. Nobody really understood how this worked. What I'm going to be talking about for the next 5 weeks or so is the gradual shaking of this black box. And it might seem like I'm throwing a lot of really annoying detail at you, but you need to stick with this. This is the part of the class that starts getting difficult for people. My experience is that what I've talked about so far has been relatively easy because it's things you can see. We're going to start getting more and more abstract. And we're going to have to start getting more and more rigorous in our thinking. And some students always fall off the wagon at this stage. They find it difficult. I'll help you as much as I'm able to. So can your lab instructors. But yeah, this is not going to be any time to slack off. And if it seems like I'm throwing a lot of crazy detail at you, what I'm doing is putting a jigsaw puzzle together. And it may not be obvious yet, but everything we'll be talking about for the next 5 weeks are pieces in this jigsaw puzzle that will reveal the answer to Darwin's unanswered questions. Why do living things vary, and how do they pass that variation on? And it starts in the Abbey of St. Thomas in what is now the Czech Republic in the city of Brno. And yes, that is how it's spelled. Czech does not always put vowels where everybody else would. So that city really is called Brno. And it starts in 1843 with a young man named Johann, who took his vows as a monk in the Roman Catholic Church, a monk in the order called the Benedictines. As part of his vows, he took a new name, so nobody remembers that his name was Johann. He became known as Brother Gregor. Brother Gregor studied at the University of Vienna and came back to Brno to teach in the monastery school. Then, as now, the Catholic Church operates quite a lot of schools. And by all accounts, Brother Gregor was a good teacher, knowledgeable teacher, and in his spare time, he was interested in various scientific problems. And he got interested in this gaping problem of heredity. How do living things make their offspring look like them? We know that this does happen, but how does it happen? Let me see, just checking something on the chat. Oh, the question is, do you have to take notes on this? You're not going to be tested on it on Thursday. You are going to be tested on it on the second exam. You do need to learn this, but as always, I'm not going to test you that hard on people's life details. You don't have to know that Brother Gregor's birth name was Johann. You don't have to memorize dates. You have to focus on ideas. So Brother Gregor first had the idea that he'd try and crossbreed rabbits and, try breeding rabbits together that had different fur colors or something like that and see what results he got. The abbot of the monastery put the kibosh on that because rabbits, breed like rabbits. You know what rabbits do. And Brother, Gregor was a monk. and it wasn't thought to be proper for, monks to have to deal with sex all the time. So yeah, the abbot said you can do your experiments, but they need to be on something less sexy. So Brother Gregor started growing garden peas, Pisum sativum, the same peas that you eat. These are what the flowers of garden peas look like. They were a good choice because, first of all, they're really easy to grow. They're pretty resistant to cold, so you can grow them over much of the year. When you're finished with them, you can eat them. That's probably where a lot of Mendel's experimental peas probably ended up in the soup. And like a lot of vegetables, and for that matter, animals, they come in lots of different varieties with different features and traits. So up at the top left, that's a garden pea with purple flowers. And at the top right, that's a garden pea with white flowers. So we get different flower colors. Down at the bottom left, that's called an inflated pod because the pea pod looks like it's been, blown up, like a balloon. And at the lower right, that's called a constricted pod because the pod's got little bulges in it, corresponding to where the peas are inside the pod. So there's lots of different pea varieties. And what's also important, is that the way that pea plants reproduce. Flowers are basically sex organs of flowering plants waving out in the breeze. The stuff that you see in the center of a typical flower in the middle of the petals, that's sex organs. Plants make flowers so that they can have flower sex. Peas are kind of unusual because you can't see the sex organs because they're completely wrapped up by these petals in the center. There's these kind of wing-like petals on the outside, and then rolled up in a cone of petals right there in the deep center of the flower. That's where the sex organs are. And a lot of flowers have male and female organs in the same flower. There are some plants that don't. A squash, for example, has flowers with male organs and separate flowers with female organs on the same plant. There are some plants where you have one plant will have male organs and a second plant will have female organs. Kiwi is the one that I can think of that does that. But most flowers have both male and female organs in the same flower. And in the case of peas, because the male and female parts are wrapped up together in those central petals, normally a pea flower self-fertilizes. Yeah, you tell a pea flower, go screw yourself. And the pea flower is like, okay, yeah, sure. That's what they do. Come on, why can't I get the slide to advance? Okay, there we go. Brother Gregor, or to give him his full name, Brother Gregor Mendel, that's a name you need to know. Gregor Mendel found that he could crossbreed specific pea plants by slicing the flowers open with a razor. If you cut a pea flower open, at the back of the flower, you've got an ovary. That's where the egg cells are produced. And surrounding the ovary, you've got tissues called the carpels that in most flowers are drawn out into a long extension called a pistil that has a sticky pad on top called a stigma. Surrounding the ovary and the stigma and all that, you've got filament-like structures called stamens. And at the tip of the stamens, you have structures called anthers that make pollen. Pollen is not exactly plant sperm, but for our purposes, we can pretend it is. And for a plant to reproduce, you have to get pollen, which contains the sperm, stuck on the stigma, the sticky pad that's connected to the ovary. and then the pollen will send little sperm nuclei down to fertilize the eggs. All right. Normally, what would happen if you just grow peas and leave them alone, pollen from those stamens will just naturally fall on the stigma and the plant will fertilize itself. Mendel found that he could cut the flowers open with a razor blade, pick up pollen from one flower with a very fine brush, spread it on the stigma with that brush, and then seal the flowers up again with a bit of wax. The reason this matters, the reason I'm talking so much about sex in bleep and pea plants, which might not seem to be the most interesting thing you'll ever learn, is that what Mendel was able to do is control very precisely what plant reproduces with what plant. Now, there are plants that just release pollen straight into the air. Oaks and pines, for example. If you've ever parked your car outside in April around here and found it covered in yellow dust, it's basically covered in plant sperm. Those plants fire off their pollen and it goes drifting through the air and always makes me sneeze a lot and ends up fertilizing female flowers, but those flowers could be a mile away. No, that pollen is just going to drift anywhere the wind blows, which doesn't really matter to me, Sorry, that was a reflex. Yeah, pollen could go anywhere. And if you're growing a bunch of oak trees, you can't really control which oaks are going to reproduce with which oaks, but you can control it if you grow peas. So Mendel could take specific pea plants and crossbreed them with each other. That's the point of all this. That's why I've been going into all of this, this level of detail. And he picked several varieties of peas that were, as we say, true breeding. Meaning if you grew those peas in your garden and just left them alone, they would self-fertilize and they would always produce more of the same. So if you take a pea plant with purple flowers and you grow it and you let it self-fertilize, you get pea seeds. And if you plant those seeds, you'll get more plants with purple flowers. And if you leave those alone, those plants will produce seeds that grow into more purple flowered plants and so on. As long as you care to keep on going, you'll always plant seeds of a purple flowered pea and you'll get purple flowered peas. And so he picked a lot of varieties that bred true like that. And he tested hypotheses as to what might happen if you crossbred two different varieties of pea. And he ended up raising 29,000 pea plants over the course of 8 years in this greenhouse in the monastery garden. It was torn down later on. I think they're trying to build a reconstruction of it because it's an important place in the history of science. And we can't look at all 20,000, but let's look at one of the set of crosses that he did. He tried crossing a purple flowered pea with a white flowered pea, cutting open those flowers and transferring pollen from one to the other. It turns out it doesn't make any difference which direction you transfer the pollen in, purple to white or white to purple. I think he usually would do both. But when he crossed a purple flowered pea with a white flowered pea, you might have hypothesized that he would get light purple flowers or maybe purple and white spotted flowers or some purple flowers and some white flowers on the same plant. But no, what he got was all of the offspring had purple flowers, never any exceptions. Sorry, seen something coming up in the chats. Okay, just a name. Here's the weird thing. When he took two of those hybrid peas and crossbred them, the second generation of peas included white flowered peas and purple flowered peas. The white flower color skipped a generation. It was present in the starting generation. In the first generation of crosses, it was not there. All of them were purple. But if you crossbred some of those purple offspring to get a second generation, white popped right back up, indistinguishable from the white color that he'd started with. There weren't any lingering purple spots. No evidence that these white flowered peas in the second generation ever had any purple flowered ancestry. That trait just jumped over a generation. To make it a little bit easier to talk about this, there's a standard abbreviation for keeping track of generations. When you start an experiment, the individuals that you crossbreed are called the P generation. P stands for parental. The offspring of that cross are called the F1 generation, and the F stands for filial. Filial means having to do with sons and daughters. Parents are supposed to love their children with parental love, and kids love their parents with filial love. Filial means having to do with sons and daughters. In this case, peas have both sexes, so they're neither, but you get the idea. It means having to do with offspring. And then if you cross two members of the F1 generation, that's called the offspring that you get there are the second filial generation. Every plant in the second filial generation is a grandchild, as it were, of the plants that you crossed in the P generation. And you can keep this going. You can have generation F3, F4, F5, however long you need. But, excuse me. But the generation that you start your experiment with is the P, letter P generation. And then after that comes F1 and F2. Okay, so what does this all mean? That purple flower color pops up the way that it does, and that the white flower color is present in the P generation, seems to hide in F1, but pops back up again in F2. Mendel's reasoning went like this. Hang on, we've still got just a couple minutes. That heredity was not blending. It's not like mixing paint. It's not like you have purple paint in the purple flowered peas and white paint in the white flower peas, and when you pour it together, you get light purple. Instead, heredity has to be due to some kind of, Mendel just called them elements, some kind of little particles rattling around inside the cells of a pea plant that made those pea plants look the way that they did. So heredity is particulate. It's not like blending a paint. It's more like blending marbles. Think about it. If I put a white marble into a jar of purple marbles, maybe I won't see that white marble, but I can still reach in and pull it out. That white marble is not affected from having been around purple marbles. Mendel argued that these elements work the same way. And Mendel reasoned the trait of purple flower color is what he called dominant to the trait of white flower color. Conversely, the trait of white flower color is recessive. Because when you cross a purple flowered pea plant and a white flowered pea plant, somehow that purple element, that purple marble thing, whatever it is, rattling around inside those plant cells, hides the existence of the white element. It masks it. You can't tell that the white element is there because its effect is covered up by the purple. I should mention, by the way, that dominant doesn't mean better. It doesn't mean superior. Recessive doesn't mean inferior or diseased or anything like that. all that it means is that a dominant trait will cover up the presence of a recessive. That's all it means. But even though those white flower colors were hidden, they could be passed on. They could appear in the F2 generation, and they could appear unchanged. Okay. And the same turned out to be true for the other 6 pairs of traits Mendel studied. Yellow seeds turned out to be dominant to green seeds. Flowers along the stems turned out to be dominant to flowers at the tips of the stems. Tall pea plant turned out to be dominant, and dwarf pea plant turned out to be recessive. These 7 pairs of traits that Mendel studied all had one trait that was dominant and the other that was recessive. Now, this was interesting, but not all that new, because back in 1751, a French guy named Maupertuis had studied a family with a family history of polydactyly, which is the medical term for having extra fingers and toes. This is not one of Maupertuis' students because it's a modern X-ray, but this is a kid with polydactyly, right? 5 fingers and a thumb. And Maupertuis showed by, examining this family and recording, who had what, he showed that it could skip generations. And like Mendel, he thought that this trait was caused by some sort of little particles rattling around, presumably inside your cells. That if you inherit a certain set of little thingamabobs rattling around in your cells, you would sprout extra fingers and extra toes. Notice we're still very much in a black box. We've got something rattling around here, but we don't yet know what it is. This is why that first black box lab is important. We will get to this. But where Mendel went further than Maupertuis had ever done is not only that he crossbred lots and lots of pea plants, but he started counting how many pea plants with each trait he got from each cross. And that turned out to be the key to the mystery. And we will look at that not this Thursday because that's the exam, but next Tuesday, we will pick up the story. So I will now stop the recording.